Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things I absolutely adore most in life is travel. And when I think of the way that I've spent my time in my life, the practice that I developed and the work I get to do is something that gives me a lot of richness and satisfaction and feeling really good about the soul experience, but also looking at the deep connection that I've had the opportunity to have with different places on the planet. So one of the absolutely phenomenal things about the modern world is our ability to be in so many different locations. You know, if you incarnated in the UK, you might have immigrated to the United States or Canada back in the day, but you probably wouldn't have gotten to experience Hawaii or Iceland. And we just have this amazing ability to go all of these really cool places and have these deep, meaningful connections to land and to collect those into a tapestry of something we've experienced in a single lifetime. And I just think it's one of the most amazing, delightful, rich, cool experiences we could possibly have. In fact, during the pandemic, the thing that I binge watched was this couple, Kara and Nate, who have gone to over 100 countries. And I just loved their backpacker budget, just being in the experiences. And as they've gotten more successful, they're wonderful luxury experiences, and I like those too. But there was this coolness to having this availability at a point where my travel plans got canceled. I had a trip to the UK on the books. I had a trip to upstate New York on the books, and those went away because of COVID. And so I did other things. I started this podcast, rather than the New York trip when that went away. And I started my online school. So, COVID had its own experiences, but I really miss travel. And there's something that's really wonderful about it, particularly if you're energetically sensitive. And I want to give you some tips and some ideas of how to take care of yourself and how to deepen your connection as you travel, as you go into different kinds of energy and have different experiences. Now, if you want me to have the full data dump of a lot of what I have to say on this, I do have a book called Sacred Travel. It's pretty cheap on Amazon. You can get the audiobook, the digital book, even a print book if you really want to go that route. But I really consolidated a lot of what I had to say. So I'm going to hit some high points, but for a more comprehensive treatment of the subject, that's a resource that you can grab. So one of the things I want to share that is something that my guides taught me, and I've never come across it in anyone else's material. Doesn't mean that it isn't there. Obviously, I haven't comprehensively read everything that's out there on the subject, and I tend... Early in my practice and early on my journey, I read a lot of books and went to a lot of teachers. But as I developed my own really strong relationship with the guides, I tended to have the more direct experience. So I am woefully out of date on what good books are out there on all things metaphysical in the modern era. But the thing that may or may not be out there, but I haven't come across, is this idea of really being aware of what layer of the land you tap into as you travel. And so one of the things that I adored about Iceland, I just really, really loved about Iceland, is it's one of the only places you can travel in the world. There may be others, but it's the only one I know about that doesn't have this experience of the land being taken away from the indigenous people or the people who came before by an outside invading source. Now, it doesn't mean they had an easy time of it in Iceland. The volcanoes would go off, and there have been a lot of hardship to people who settled there. but the original people who settled there, at least as much as we can, discern from history, other than a little monastic settlement, were the people who lived on the land and had children and, have had this experience of the land. So it's kind of cool to be on land that doesn't have genocide associated with it or subjugation. And when you're traveling, it's really useful to be aware of the context of the history of the place that you're traveling. And then you may want to use your intention and focus to drop in at a level with the land that isn't about the layer that has that particular story. So my best example of that is Ireland. I love Ireland. I've been there twice, and there is something that is uniquely sweet and exquisite and potent and gorgeous and just so wonderful about Ireland. And I've zoomed around a good bit of it, and there's a good bit that I didn't get to zoom around, and I would love to go back and to have more experiences. So there are these standing stones and these sacred wells and these beautiful valleys, and it's exquisite. And it also has a really tough history. During the potato famine, people were starving to death in massive quantities, and Ireland was still exporting food. And that tells you about the political structure enforced by England taking over and how they dealt with power and might and all of those kind of things to basically be taking resources out of the land beyond what was needed to feed the people. And people dying, people having to leave their homelands, the pressure that meant that it was, so dangerous to try to have an uprising. There were lots of uprisings. They were put down in really, really bloody fashion. It's a hard story of how people justify treating other people where money is involved, and that idea of being able to colonize and subjugate other people. And of course, we see that, echoed throughout the world, many, many stories of that. But for the time in Ireland, I didn't want to do the service of trying to work on cleaning that up. I often get pulled into that. I've had Holocaust survivors I've had the opportunity to work with, and people who are descendants of Holocaust survivors or other events. And I'm certainly very willing to do this kind of transpersonal cleanup of historic messes that humans have made. But that wasn't what I wanted to do in Ireland. I wanted to really connect in deeply with the magic and the power and the potency of the land and talk to the land guardians and talk to the spirits and have those kind of primal experiences. And so part of that was just knowing to drop in to a different layer and just let that other layer have its thing, the collective experience of subjugation and suffering and conflict and all of that. It was still there. I didn't ignore it or disregard it, but I was very deliberately working to drop in at the layer of the experience I wanted to have, which was a wonderful and worthwhile kind of thing to do. Other places have more contemporary complexity, so one of the things I found really potent and interesting about travel in Peru was that there's still a really contemporary relationship to shamanism and magic. And at the same time, there isn't necessarily the ethical approach that you would be more likely to find if you visited a metaphysical shop in the United States or a booth. So a lot of the neo-shamanism, the new shamanism, the resurgence of shamanism, what we're co-creating as practitioners who are going back to this fundamental form of relating to the world around us. So for those of you who don't know, my training started with Michael Harner, who noticed as an anthropologist there were all these common elements in all these different traditions, and that this was a universal expression of shamanism that was a way that someone who didn't come from an indigenous lineage could essentially his intention was reclaim our universal birthright, the idea that we all come from these shamanic roots without the danger of cultural appropriation. And it is a complicated topic that I'm not going to go into, but being in Peru, you have a living, breathing shamanic culture, and there's a lot of money at stake. And the traditions just don't have the ethics that we have of do no harm. Black magic isn't okay. It's not appropriate to manipulate people with magic. So walking around, it's complicated. If you go through a bazaar, some of the objects will have spells on them to make this cheap thing that may have been made in China look really shiny and really attractive and really appealing. And it's not to say there weren't beautiful woven goods and exquisite things that you could purchase at very reasonable prices, but the buy me spells were in abundance. And I actually had a moment where I walked into a shop that I think, among other things, offered black magic services. I'm speculating based on what my guide showed me, but I think I wasn't supposed to see it, but I just did and kind of wandered in. I was a little discombobulated. I'd been through the whole, open air market with all the different things to look at. And I walked in and I immediately felt my mistake. I'm like, "Ooh, this isn't a place I should be at." And I immediately turned and walked out. But one of the people there threw an energetic knife into my back. And I found it immediately. I'm in a very, very close connection to my auric field, and the guides helped me pull it out and repair the damage. No big deal. You're fine. And I was so mad. I was like, they're like, "Yeah, we don't think it's a good idea for you to try to get into a psychic battle with somebody who, is well developed their black magic and hurting other skills. Like, just chill. It was an experience. You're okay. Nothing bad happened." And so I just kind of breathed through it, but it was something to note about how much more discernment and being in my center and navigating, because the flip side was, there were marvelous shamans available to work with us, to do ceremony with us, to take us to sacred sites, to help us connect in, to have Palo Santo there that we could smudge ourselves with. So there were amazing experiences mixed in, and unlike some of the places where I travel where I'm like, okay, I'm going to look really weird, but I'm just going to stand here and put my hands on the rock wall and be entranced with the energy. Years ago, I was in Death Valley, and there's a canyon that I absolutely adore, Titus Canyon. It's a slot canyon you can drive through, and the sun was going down, and we were, driving along, and then, somebody went past us, and that was great, and we were communing with the walls and, feeling the energy because it's all shot with quartz, and they went on through, and then they came back for us because the sun had gone down, and you couldn't really see anything, and it was really weird that we were still like not coming out. Did our car break down? Which was super sweet of them. But there are a lot of places I travel where I'm just aware of how much more woo-woo I am and how much more attuned to energy, and the experiences I want to have are going to be really different than what's kind of normal. Whereas, getting all blissed out on energy at some of the sacred sites in Peru, there's context for that. Fellow tourists might think you're weird, but the people there are like, yeah, okay, cool. And so there was a richness to that. This living, embodied shamanic culture was very cool, but there was also complexity. And one of the things I like about living on the West Coast in California is we have our own really hard stories of genocide toward the indigenous people. So I'm not making light of that, but because a lot of California was desert, the people were more spread out. It just wasn't supporting the number of people, and the period where awfulness was happening was a little bit shorter. There just doesn't seem to be the density of human karma in the same way that I experience on the East Coast. There's just a lightness. And I remember a particular trip where I went to New Mexico, and it was really an interesting mixture because the pain and the trauma of what people had experienced was something that one moment I would be really in the flow of the magic and the beauty of the land, and then I would be bumping into something that was heavier and more dense. So in addition to that intention for layers and kind of understanding where you are, pay attention to how much filter you may need. So someplace like Death Valley that's just wild amounts of energy pouring and moving and available. You want to be respectful to the guardians of the land, but there's not a lot of human complexity that you're going to stumble through. Iceland, really clean energy, very small population. Most of them hang out in Reykjavik. So just being out in this magnificent land, it was all really clean and these strong organizing principles of the land magic, which was really blissful. Whereas someplace like Ireland, there's just more complexity. The British Isles have been occupied for a really, really, really long time, and there are layers and layers and layers of the next wave of people coming in and driving out the previous, and there's a lot of changing hands and fighting over that land that goes back for a really, really long time. There are just more layers there. At the same time, really potent ley lines, really, really beautiful energy. So just going in, knowing that in some places you may need to have some protections in place. One of the things that was really beautiful about Peru as an American tourist is our money goes a long way. So it allowed us to tip really generously at a rate that, middle class people without the most discretionary income could afford to do. And that was really cool. And there was the ability to get a lot of help. When I took a group down there, we had a whole tour bus and just the most absolutely wonderful people showing us around. They were so kind and so attentive. But at the same time, there's also kind of high stakes in, parting tourists from money. And there were people who were like, my husband hand carved this thing. And, there were piles of them in the airport exactly the same. Clearly, they were mass manufactured. So there's just a certain sort of awareness when you travel, especially if you're energetically sensitive. And for someone else, they might just kind of, blow past the different layers. And one of the things that was really interesting for me came up. I've been to Hawaii a number of times. I really love Hawaii. And one of the islands that I went to at one point was Molokai. And the energy is more complicated there. And I was traveling with the partner I was with at a time, and in a lot of ways he was a hoot, lots of Sagittarius energy, very impulsive, very playful, very hedonistic in nature. So there were a lot of ways it was a really fun relationship, but there was also some ways that we were a little bit of a mismatch for how we approached the energy of the land. When I traveled with other friends, there was more, kind of feeling in. And so we went to this site that I'm like, oh, this is really sacred. It's sacred in terms of the ley lines and the land, and it's really sacred in terms of what the people have done to relate to this. I could really feel the power and the magic and the intention. And for me, that was an indication to slow down, to feel into it, to ask permission to step onto the land of the guardians, to move with care, just like I would move through, their beautiful churches. And even though that's not necessarily my religious background, I still move through it as something that is sacred to a whole lot of people, and I'm having an experience of this sacred place, even if it's not my belief system. He, on the other hand, was kind of like, oh, big energy, I feel this, let me run over and put my hands on everything. And I could feel the tension that arose from that. And I think it can be problematic when you're sort of at that in-between place where you're aware enough about energy to be, ooh, shiny, there's big energy here, but not discerning enough to kind of know what it is. I think there's some people who get kind of discombobulated with Sedona because for some people it's just such a delight to feel energy. They don't necessarily know how to track it, so you go someplace with massive amounts of really big energy and you start feeling things, and that can be amazing. But some of the vortexes are just more about recycling land energy. They're just chewing up heavy land energy and putting it back into the flow. And that's not the most optimal place to just fling your highly organized human auric field. And again, some people get along with it better than others, but just because there's big energy doesn't necessarily mean it's healing or supportive or aligned or optimized. So that sense of discernment and that sense of stepping onto sacred land with a certain reverence and asking permission and feeling into it. One of the things that's really important to me when I travel is honoring the guardians of the land. So when I arrive, there's a certain setting intention to ask for permission to go play and have experiences and talk to the land spirits and talk to the trees and the rocks and, just be in this experience. And I'll often make an offering. Usually it's just pouring out a little bit of water from my water bottle, just as a, let me honor the land that I'm walking on. Thank you. Some people have more elaborate rituals. Nothing wrong with that, but it can be very, very simple. But it can just be that intention and focus to come into right relationship with the land guardian. And even if you don't feel it or hear it or see it or kind of get the feedback, going through the sincere intention, I think can make a really big difference to the experience you have when you move onto land. And I think it can almost pass you through an invisible veil to see and perceive things that might be hidden. So I adore Death Valley. It's got this massive land magic, but it's not necessarily in the spots that are the big tourist stopping places. So all these tourists are like tromping down to be at the lowest point in the northern hemisphere, down in the salt flats. And that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But here I am at a random mile marker on the side of the road with this, mountain just pulsing with life and energy and magic. And, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, this is an amazing spot. Look at what's here. Feel what's here. So when you kind of slow down, you may be magnetized to some things that aren't as obvious, but still hold a lot of gifts and energy and possibilities that can be really rich to connect in with. Another thing I really recommend, and I go into detail for how to do this, so I can't really cover it in the podcast, but you can get this in the book or you may have your own approach, is when you travel, I think it's really wise to sleep in protected space. So whenever I go into a hotel room, I just recognize that, they do a good job in a lot of countries of leaving the hotel rooms spotless as far as, other people's remains of dirt and such, but they don't do energy cleansing. So I always like to clear the Airbnb or the hotel room, and I can do it very, very quickly. Obviously, burning sage in a hotel room is not really cool, but you can do it with sound. You can do it with intention. You can set out a little baby crystal altar that you take with you that helps to clear and protect the space. There are lots of ways to go about it, but I like to clear the space so I get a clean slate and I'm not kind of at the point where I'm resting, because, for me, having a place to really rest and recover, because travel is so stimulating, there's such deep experiences, is really helpful for me. It really makes a difference. And then I put up a bubble of protection and an invisibility kind of shield around the hotel room or the Airbnb. And the reason for that is, just like, I'm being a tourist and going, ooh, shiny ley line, ooh, power spot, ooh, shiny human with big energy, can become a attraction of beings in the area that aren't necessarily bad, but are kind of like, what's this one? This one has some interesting things going on. And being peered at in the night doesn't necessarily help. So I try to, just for sleeping, kind of not make myself visible on that level, with the intention that I set for the protections, as well as just filtering out weird stuff that can wander in. There's some places with some really heavy and intense energy, and sometimes geographically very close together. There were areas of land where I'm like, oh, this is magnificent, and there have been a couple of places where I'm like, wow, the energy does not feel good here. And and they can be very, very close together. And if you're on a road trip, you don't necessarily know until you're in the middle of it, and you may be too tired for it to be safe to drive. So it's really great to be able to pop up the protections you need for the night and then go on to more conducive land to hang out on. And of course, if you set up these kind of energetic structures, you want to take them down in the morning so other people don't end up with kind of the remains of something that was particular to you. That kind of good manners of leave the campsite cleaner than you found it means not leaving derelict, abandoned, energetic structures as well. And another thing that I really like that I want to offer is the possibility of solo travel. And this can be complicated, especially depending on your relationship to safety. It can tend to cost more. It can tend to feel a little bit more vulnerable. So they're different trips. Like I have an enormous longing to go to Egypt, but I wouldn't do that as solo travel. Whereas I went on a cruise up through Canada. I started off in Montreal and then went to Quebec City and out through the St. Lawrence Gulf and up to Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. And it was really, really exquisite. And that was a solo trip. And, there's a benevolence to kind of those areas and being on a cruise ship because, there's a certain just structure and ease with that, which I really enjoyed. But part of what I like about solo travel is if I like someone enough to be willing to go on a trip with them, they're very compelling to me. And as humans, we're really wired for relationships. We're really wired to pay attention to other people. And as such, I can miss a lot of the richness of the energy experience around me. So I can feel energy when I'm on the move, but I feel a lot more if I come into stillness. So this is driving, this is walking. The deepest experience I'm going to have is if I'm, able to like sit on a rock and just really drop in, because I can drop all of the parts of me that are, staying on the road properly or, handling the mechanics of balance, which are more complicated than we realize. So there's something about being able to just free up all my senses to really drop in with the land. And when I do travel with people, it's great to have people who really get what I'm up to and are interested in sharing that. One of my most exquisite memories I probably wouldn't have done by myself, but we hiked into Mosaic Canyon after dark and just laid on these huge slot canyon water etched big, it's like seats of marble where we could just lay there with the warmth of the day and watch night happen and stars come out and the moon eventually rose over the edges of the canyon. And we were there in silence for hours, just being there in that experience, and it was absolutely marvelous. And I explained it to somebody that I was dating a while back, and that they thought that sounded horrible, like that would just be the most tedious thing ever. So sometimes it's helpful with companions, but I was in a really beautiful park in Arizona, very sacred land, and I drove all the way through, and then I went back and drove back the other way because I knew I would see different things. And so there's just this availability with solo travel to follow the pulse of your own experience and where you're drawn. And there's a lot of intimacy with self to be had because you're not busy with your to-do list. You're not like, okay, I got to call so-and-so back and this has to happen and, I should really get around to this. There's an openness. And if you're someone who's in a female body, there's a really good chance that you have diffuse awareness, which is to pour in all directions, which means that you're paying attention and tracking, everything that goes on around you. And that can get in the way of really being able to hone in on the essence of the land. It's something we have to do with our awareness. And again, if I'm with people, I just find that what's going on with them, like part of what makes me really good as a shamanic practitioner is how much I can read about someone, the shifts in their energy, where things are blocked, all of these kind of things. And so when I'm present with people, people can be really, really loud, and I can filter that, but it's not the same as just having the spaciousness. When I rented a car and I was out driving, I just had this exquisite sun-drenched day on Prince Edward Island. I did get sucked into the Anne of Green Gables stuff that I read as a kid, but I also just drove around like some back roads, and it was beautiful and just so lovely. And it would have been a different experience if I'd been with another person. And so again, depending on the trip, like I probably wouldn't go to Peru by myself. I know there are plenty of women who would, and that's awesome if you feel comfortable with that. But for me, if I feel unsafe, that's going to be loud and get in the way. So it's not even necessarily safety at the level of fact, it's feeling safe enough to access these deeper places. And I think about that when I travel, is if I have something that's working my last nerve, it gets in the way of my being able to really expand into tuning into the things that I want. So I'm thoughtful about that too. I'm thoughtful about doing my best to set myself up for good sleep. That doesn't always happen. Food at the right times. When I was younger, I used to go to these power spots and get so blown out, and then, have a shamanic hangover the next day. And as I get older, I've come to value more stillness and being able to drop in compared to the running around frantically trying to see all the things that with some of my younger travel. So I know this isn't complete or comprehensive, but I hope it gives you some thoughts and ideas that will just kind of help you deepen with sacred travel and connecting with the land. There's a part of me that just is so baffled by people and what they're missing out on if they don't have an energetic sensitivity and an ability to feel the land, or it could be the trees. For me, there's such a difference when I go to the giant sequoias, for the really enormous old sequoias and the younger sequoias. The younger sequoias are cool. I like forest. It's nice. Nothing wrong with it. But there's just a intense, amazing, energetic experience when I'm with those very big, very old trees that isn't present in the same way with their younger descendants. I know for some of us, our energetic sensitivity makes life more complicated. It's harder to be in crowds. We don't always know what energy is our own. We can get tired faster because we're processing more sensory input, more information. But when I travel and I get to have these ecstatic experiences of land, it's one of the things that, even with the price of admission, even with all the ways that energetic sensitivity can act in some ways like a disability, it can just make it harder to move through the world. It's so worth it. It's like I would not change this for anything. And that's part of the experience that gets unlocked of all that goes with this sensitivity that has then been focused and developed into a learnable skill set. So when I have the connection to the guides, some of it is energetic sensitivity, but a lot of it is the learnable skill side of it. So if you feel like you're not somehow naturally having the experiences you want to have, please understand that you can absolutely train your awareness to learn how to drop in and have these kind of deeper experiences. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.